it is kind of wild, Peter, considering how this year has started and the actions in Venezuela, and then kind of markets to look past it. I'm just curious your view on this, and I'm curious what kind of calls you were getting from either clients at your firm.
So we certainly had a lot of questions about Venezuela over the weekend and into this week. It's at Academy we work with 30 retired generals and admirals, so we've been doing.
We had
a lot.
one on yesterday.
That's right, yeah, Massar Robinson, he's great. So yeah, I think the market moves actually do make sense, though. I think this is start of the year stuff. You got CES going on, so there's a lot of headlines coming out of Vegas that people seem to like. So I'm not surprised that we're kind of rallying. Away from that, I think on Venezuela, it was a very impressive military operation. Whatever else you want to think about it, it was very successful, incredibly fast. This very precision. Now I think we're not going to see a lot on oil, energy prices. I think there's a lot of building out. And what I think this is going to really
None of this is a quick fix.
None of this is a quick fix. And I think what this is really going to boil down to is this is our first real confrontation with China away from either's kind of sphere of influence, right? If you think about all the trade negotiations, it was mainland China versus us. There were some tariffs, but all of a sudden we're going and saying we're going to take stuff.
Yeah.
China's invested a lot of money there. China has a lot of loans to companies. How is that friction going to play out? China's going to use their lawyers to try and stop things. I think this is really important too for China, because if they kind of get pushed out of Venezuela very easily and they lose money, the rest of the world where they put out their Belt and Road Initiative starts looking at that, and it could be a big roll-on effect. So I think we're going to see friction. I honestly think we're going to see China first attack with lawyers. And they won't attack anything until they start seeing what we're actually doing. So far, it's just been a lot of talk and noise.
Right.
Venezuela was the story yesterday, and it certainly is today. But in the last few minutes, Greenland has become more of a story. President Trump and his team are discussing a range of options for acquiring Greenland, a Reuters reporter says in a post on X, citing a White House statement. Where does that strategy fit in?
That one's a hard one for us. I think when we look at the world, when we kind of Iran, we could see maybe doing something to the IRGC. I don't think we would do anything with the religious side of Iran in any way, shape, or form.
When you say do something, what do you mean?
Maybe we would support, to attack some of the IRGC facilities or something.
Okay.
If the IRGC gets very aggressive against the protesters, I could see something going on there. Cuba seems a little bit more easier to deal with. We already have the, USS Ford is in the Caribbean Sea. It's actually not a very efficient place for it to be. It's too small of an area for an aircraft carrier group, and it's due for some refitting and remodeling. So I think we will try and use it as much as possible. So that's why we weren't surprised about action in Venezuela. I think we could see activity in and around Panama Canal where we try and either buy it or invest in it.
Is that for a China proxy?
I think for a China proxy, and again, I think we really want to control shipping through Central South America, and the Panama Canal is a big part of that. And don't forget, Marco Rubio is the first place he went. On Greenland, I think we all struggle with why this term annex or take keeps coming up. I think that's a struggle.
So to recap, Panama, Venezuela, Cuba, Iran makes sense. Greenland, not so much.
I find it very difficult to play why we would disrupt NATO. And again, I think we've been less thoughtful on NATO and where its important is, but this kind of puts a lot of friction. And even from a business standpoint, I think I can believe that in Venezuela, there's a lot of rare earths and critical minerals that have been underinvested in. I find it hard to believe someone hasn't been checking out Greenland and saying, this is just economically unviable. I do know, and I think this is interesting, because one of our generals is actually now the Undersecretary of War, and before he became Undersecretary of War while he was still working with us, he did talk about and point out that China has more icebreakers than we do. And so China views themselves as an Arctic nation. Russia clearly views themselves as an Arctic nation. So maybe this is something to do with, as the polar ice caps are melting, that it creates different routes. So we want some more protection there. So maybe some of that makes sense. But again, that all feels like it could be done within the confines of existing rules and regulations rather than having kind of this annex or take concept.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. How are you thinking about this year when it comes to the Trump White House, and especially with midterms looming? I've heard some folks say that, listen, there's a lot of pressure on the administration to get things done early in the year because as midterms loom, there are expectations that there might be pushback against the GOP and the Trump administration. But I'm just curious what you're telling your clients.
So what we've really liked is what we've been calling PROSEC, or Production for Security, and it's kind of along the lines of resilience. And that includes anything from chips, electricity. So Intel, for example, I think there's going to be huge pressure on companies to use U.S. chip manufacturers, right? We have to break away from Taiwan. I think there's realization we're not producing enough electricity. We will deregulate, we'll get electricity in all forms running. I do think President Trump will give up on his kind of hatred of solar and adapt solar, but you're going to see solar, nuclear. I do. I think it's just
Wind is a step too far?
I think wind's a step too far.
He really does not like wind.
He really does not like. I think there's a visceral hatred to it. Partly, I think it does destroy views. I think there's questions about its efficiencies, and it does kill birds and stuff, and that seems to really bother him. So I'm not going to fight the wind. I do think on solar.
House cats kill a lot of birds too.
House cats.
Truly.
That is probably true. We had one that was very good at that. So I think those are all the things that we can invest in. We just saw yesterday $2.7 billion going into uranium companies. So I think you can move away from the AI story and into anything that's going to be part of this building out of infrastructure. You know, you've got CAT, you've got Deere, Navistar, all the heavy equipment makers. I think we're going to see real efforts to become slightly more independent.
Are all nations doing that?
So how I see this starting is the U.S. really jump-started this, right? The U.S. has been all over this. I think what we're starting to see now is capital is going to follow next. So investors are starting to follow this. We talk to private equity companies who are starting to scour the universe for, hey, who's got mining rights that have been unused? Who's got some interesting patents in and around these rare earths and critical minerals? I think you're going to see, again, these huge build-outs potentially in electricity production. So it's capitalism.
So globalization dead?
Well, I think other countries are going to figure this out eventually that they have to do it. I think at some point, Europe's going to release like Shell and BP to actually do what they're phenomenally good at. And so far, there's still constraints. But I think everyone's adopting this. I think you have to look much closer when you're thinking about supply chains. Domestic
political risk of this new world order. That's something I've been thinking a lot about, especially in an election year, because we thought that the Make America Great Again movement was really about keeping within the U.S.'s borders, not getting involved in foreign wars. The president has talked about leaving countries outside of the U.S. alone, and that's not really what we've gotten in the last few months.
No, though I will say, I think if prior to Liberation Day and stuff, I think there was a lot of hope that we'd work very closely with Canada, because Canada has a lot of things that we need that would be a big part of this. We'd work closer with Mexico, and we kind of got away from that. So I think this starts, maybe it's just trying to reshape how these relationships work. Ultimately, I think we're going to need things like potash. We're going to need to work with Canada. But I do think, they laid it out in the National Security Strategy, and it's only 39 pages of double space. It's even I could read it. So I would recommend reading it because I think it does form this way. And we've been telling corporations for years now, and I think now we're getting a lot of incoming calls. Like we've been saying, if you are manufacturing in Thailand and Vietnam, you're not really diversified because you're going through the same shipping lanes. So I think you've got to be very careful about shipping. If you're looking at building a new plant this year, I think you want to build it in North, South America or Central America or the U.S. precisely because that's where we have a lot more control. So I think that's where corporations follow into this. And I don't want to say it's going to be us by ourselves. What I've been trying to say is I think for every single commodity or product, every country is going to have an X amount that they want to do themselves so they can be sufficient. Y you can do with your close neighbors, and then Z or Z you just do on the open market. And I think that's going to vary by country to country what they can do. But I think Europe's behind on this. I think the sad thing is, if I look at what we need to do in the U.S., you have a pretty good roadmap. Just look what China's done for the last 10 years, right? They've basically done Prozac on steroids, and we're just starting to do it, but it's exciting. And I think some of it will last past an election cycle, because Biden did do the CHIPS Act, right? So Biden was not, immune to understanding this.
He continued a lot of President Trump in his first term, his China strategy.
Right. So I think this is now truly going to replace ESG as a major policy tool, as a major way corporations think, and how investors think, right? If everything was ESG, I think where we were really is, if you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, one probably, Psych 101, it proves I took it, but we were kind of at this kind of high self-actualization period, like what would we like sustainability to look like? But it was all based on the premise that we had the basics covered. Well, we don't really have the basics covered if we're dependent on China for those basics. So I think this is a pullback to say, to be truly sustainable and independent and resilient, you need to do some core level of this stuff yourself. And that's where I think we are. It's that evolution.
What are the implications of that in terms of cost to society, in terms of, does it make things more expensive? If we're doing more manufacturing in the United States, well, labor isn't cheap here. So I'm just curious, what are the implications? What does it mean for economic growth maybe in the United States?
So I think it's going to be potentially a little bit higher on some prices. So it's very good that oil and some of these energy costs are coming down. That will help on this. At the flip side of that, though, is if people can go back to working for, I hate to say the word, but I'll say it, like national champions, right? Where you feel that your industry, your job is important to the country, you probably go home feeling slightly safer about your job. I think there's a lot of benefits from this. We've been talking about this. Spider Marks is great. He kind of coined the phrase for us.
Yeah.
But
who is?
Spider Marks, General Spider Marks. He's quite awesome. But he coined the phrase, like, we're in a pre-war environment. And we've always been in a post-war environment until recently. And I think pre-war sounds a little bit scary, but it's just like deterrence. If you understand that you're in a pre-war and you do the preparation properly, you deter the enemy. And I think the things that to me are really crucial about a pre-war is it creates a sense of urgency, which we're seeing, and self-sacrifice.
We're speaking with Peter Tchir, head of macro strategy at Academy Securities. He joins us here in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. Peter, you mentioned we went through a little bit around the globe when we talked about Iran, we talked about Venezuela, we talked about Greenland, Cuba, Panama. What about Mexico? And what about Colombia? Have they been put on notice?
I think Colombia's been put on notice. I've been much more focused on Mexico. So one of the things that we believe to some degree is we've been changing the rules of engagement with Venezuela, right? If you go back 4 months ago, who would have thought we would shoot a drug boat? We're now doing that. I think the world would have gone ballistic if we did that in the Gulf of Mexico or Gulf of America. Now, though, it's now standard operating procedure, right? We've attacked some of the drug facilities. I suspect that somewhere in Q1, Q2, late Q1, early Q2, we approach Mexico very serious and tell Sheinbaum, like, we can work with you to get rid of your cartels, or we can get rid of your cartels without you. And to me, the one thing we haven't talked to, I know we've been talking about so much oil. If we can solve Venezuela's drug problem and cartel problem and Mexico, it makes both of those countries safer, more viable countries. Fewer people need to migrate out of those countries.
Say. Yeah.
So I think it fits perfectly.
But then in terms of drugs, maybe I'm crazy here, and I know we've only got about 40 seconds left here. What about China and fentanyl? Like, have we covered that? If we're talking about narco-terrorists,
I think
some might say, wait a minute.
I'm looking at this more from the ability to kind of make those countries safer, where you have some ability to influence it so that people don't want to leave. A lot of people, you talk to people coming from Mexico, their choice is lead or silver.
Yeah.
You either fight the cartel and die, or you join the cartels.
Look at Venezuela, 8 million people or something have left.
So I think if you can do that, and on top of that, if you cut the head off the snake, maybe the drug cartels and their activities in the U.S. do slow down.
So are you positive about the year? Are you upbeat?
I am, actually. I'm very positive. I think, again, this build-out's going to be very interesting.
Yeah.
The biggest risk to me is China threatening and doing something about rare earths and critical minerals, because we're not there yet where we need to be.
10 seconds. If President Trump wasn't in the White House again for a second term, would we be having this conversation?
No, I think he actually really kind of planned ahead of this. Though some of it, I think we would have finally seen, because we've been talking about rare earths, critical minerals for years and years. We're finally realizing the CHIPS Act realized some of this. This is what
COVID
progression.
too.
How we're doing it is just stronger and more aggressive.